All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Joe, for those of you who don't know me, although I think I know a lot of the people on this call, but I manage the Aquaculture Information Exchange. It's a NOAA and USDA backed internet platform, social networking platform for the American aquaculture community. Um, and Today's webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series where our members present on their areas of expertise. And if you've been attending any of the ones this month, we've sort of been focused on workforce development or career development. And so this one is again in line with that. Um, Chris Payne comes, or he created a leadership in science, I believe is the name of the group on the AIE. Um, and one of the questions that one of our members asked in regards to one of those posts was, how do you communicate with people outside of the typical science fields, including with aquaculture? And so, based on that, I talked to Chris and we sort of brainstormed this presentation slash workshop. Um, so yeah, hope y'all enjoy it. And yeah, we'll do Q&A at the end. So take it away, Chris.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joe. I really do appreciate being here. I'm very excited to get this webinar out to the community that you have built. And so we're going to go through a very quick overview of how to connect with non-STEM audiences for those of us who get to interact with individuals or groups outside of our aquaculture field. So everything that I'm going to talk about, we could delve into it even deeper and deeper. I do that in longer workshops, but this is a great place to get started as a general overview of the topic to hopefully pique your interests and want to explore it more. So just to give a brief introduction of myself, my name's Chris. I've been a marine biologist here in the marine science field for over 20 years. I've worked in a number of different areas, started out in marine science education. I've worked in fisheries, aquaculture, mostly in the aquarium world. I'm a big diver. Specific to aquaculture, most recently I've worked on lobster systems, oyster farms, kelp farms, all here in Maine. I'm in the South Portland area, and I've been here for about a few years after living in California for about 12 years. And so aside from the science degree that I have and the experience that I have, I went back to school and I got a master's in leadership, specific to nonprofit management. But I wanted to start this company, Dirigo Science Connection, to help strengthen the communication and the interpersonal relationships and teamwork within the science field. And so that's why I'm here today as a scientist, science professional, talking about communication. As far as what to expect here today, we're going to go through different ways to approach your communication, understanding your audience, what kind of words we want to use and eliminate, and then kind of get into a little bit of storytelling. And then hopefully we'll have some action items that we can take away, and we'll be able to have plenty of time for discussion. The QR code, if you want, you can take a picture of that. That will send you to a website that has some worksheets that you can download that will go along with the presentation. Even if you don't follow them here today while we're talking, I recommend using them as a resource for you later. You can share them with your teams afterwards, or we can use them as a resource when we, do our discussion and questions at the end. So, as Joe had said, this was something that was brought up by one of our members, Bridget, and she was asking some recommendations on how to communicate with leaders outside of STEM. She said she's an emerging leader in STEM. She often felt overlooked or struggled with communicating with other leaders outside of STEM. Sometimes it's technical leadership jargon, but it seems to often be a reflection of different priorities instead. A focus on convincing people to take actions rather than on basing decisions on sound science. And so that sparked this conversation. I think originally I was going to do something completely different, but I had been asked this type of a question multiple times at the same around the same time. So I thought that this would be a good thing to bring up. So I just want to thank Bridget for really just sparking this discussion and getting it going, because it really is very important. So as a leadership development professional, I always teach that communication is the foundation of leadership practice and relationship building. And specific to us as aquaculture scientists and aquaculture professionals, we're constantly finding ourselves in situations where we need to be communicating our work so that we're able to push it forward. So our communication skills, they can be tools to grow our community and educate, but we have to do it effectively. So we have to have a clear message. We want to strengthen our active listening skills. We want to be aware of our body language in the middle of our conversations. Okay, we want to build and strengthen on our emotional intelligence, because that helps prepare us to walk into some of these challenging conversations. All right, and then that will help us create safe spaces for constructive feedback on both sides, and then hopefully open up areas for new and diverse ideas throughout the industry. And this is all important because the way in which we communicate has a significant impact on the goals that we're trying to achieve, whatever that might be. Okay. So this type of effective communication, whether we're trying to gain funding or convince the public or legislators to allow you to build a new farm, or trying to market your product, or just basics of just giving a presentation like this, effective communication is going to help you see more positive results a little bit more often. So the main theme for this webinar is going to be finding ways to translate all of your really awesome work that you do for a whole number of different audiences and stakeholders who might not work in this field. And we're going to try to find a way to connect what we do with what their comments and questions and concerns are. So we got to find ways to effectively and efficiently communicate these concepts and results so that we have a greater impact without preaching what we think should happen as scientists. So here we get to provide information and some background in a way that people can understand, and then help them make their own educated decisions. And by communicating properly, when you have increased transparency and your credibility starts to increase and improve, and you've built a level of trust, and you're starting to really collaborate with a lot more people and groups, and now you start to build on a foundation that you can see will grow, so that you continue to collaborate and improve with cooperation with your stakeholders, so that we can see improved results in whatever it is we're trying to achieve. So some factors that we want to think about, like, we always want to keep in mind when you're in the middle of a conversation or a presentation, are you really in the conversation? Are we listening? Are we active listening? Okay. Or are you simply there just to tell people what you want them to hear without listening to their side, to their point of view? So we want to listen, right? We want to make sure we have an understanding. We want to ask for their input. Okay. We want to ask clarifying questions so we have a better understanding of what it is they're trying to get to. All right. we want to make sure that we're following up with them, and then make sure that they also have a higher level of understanding when you leave that conversation. And then, like I said, if you need to follow up, continue that conversation later, so it's ongoing. But our audience is always going to be different, right? So we need to understand who that audience is, and then we have to adjust as needed, because we can't approach every single conversation the same exact way. We have to be able to adapt our communication styles. So when we think about our non-STEM audiences, okay, those people that are outside of our science and aquaculture world and community, or maybe they're just adjacent to it. Maybe they're here in your own community. Maybe they're people establishing regulations or making policy, investments, working in media, or of course, consuming the products that we're putting out to market. Or, as I've seen, maybe you're just simply trying to convince or trying to tell your parents what the heck it is you do for a living, because it's been 22 years and they still really couldn't tell me what it is I've done over the years. And then industry collaborators, I put down at the bottom with an asterisk, because they can be people or industry workers that are still around aquaculture, but maybe they aren't specifically doing the science part of it, right? So a lot of our companies and organizations have marketing departments that help us put out the work that we're doing, and sponsorship teams that help get our funding, and executive teams that are overseeing everything but maybe aren't in the weeds as much, board of directors, and then other organizations that are just trying to support you, even other fisheries industry professionals or aquaculture professionals who maybe just have a different vernacular that they use because they're working in a different part of the world, or even just on the other side of the country. And so whatever that is, we need to be able to communicate our goals and mission and story to them, especially if they are working and their job is to send that message out. We need to be able to have a way to simplify all the cool stuff that we're doing so that they can share it with the public. So I've already used this word. I'm going to continue to use this word. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. That a stakeholder here in this capacity is any person or group that can influence the objectives of a company or be influenced by the company's actions. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's somebody you're working with directly, but anybody who is touched, impacted, or affected by the work that you're doing, or that can have an impact on your goals and funding and all of that. So what drives these different stakeholders? So, this is just a small list of options for who stakeholders would be. It's not a full list, but, they all have reasons to be involved or interested or connected to your business or your organization, whether it's positive or it's not. And so the way that you approach these stakeholders, it has to be catered to who they are and how they are invested in your work. Okay. Is it politics? Is it optics, right? Are we trying to make it look like we're saving the world as an investor? Or, are the consumers, they're concerned about the quality and the convenience of the product that you're selling, and social responsibility that you're taking to get that product to market? The community is going to want to know how it's impacting their environment and their quality of life. I do a lot of that type of work here in South Portland. I'm on the Conservation Commission. I'm on the Comprehensive Planning Committee. And so these discussions are happening every week or so, where we're trying to understand how we can shift gears in a changing climate to help preserve the small town community of South Portland. Okay. And then you've got collaborators that hopefully just want to help you share your mission and connect to that because they believe in it, and the results, and want to push that forward. So first thing I want you to think about, first activity, if you did get to that QR code, this is on there, but we don't need it to do any of that. So I want you to take about 30 or so seconds and either type it into the chat and we'll talk about it later, or write it down and we'll talk about these a little bit more in depth afterwards. But I want you to start thinking about who your non-STEM stakeholders are, right? I want to be able to prepare you to recognize before you walk into a meeting or a conversation or an interview, a presentation or a public hearing, right? So let's just take about 30 seconds and just jot down or send it in the chat, whatever you want to do, and identify who some of these non-aquaculture stakeholders are that you are interacting with on a regular basis. And then we'll get into it a little bit more at the end. Beachgoers, 1000%. Local government is going to be a huge one. Property owners, another big one. And this industry, we understand their perspective, but it's something we need to prepare for these types of conversations. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but I wanted you to just start thinking about it as we continue this conversation. Just so you So let's start understanding how we can change some of the challenging technical talk into ways that our stakeholders that you've just recognized can start to understand. This industry, this aquaculture industry, is so unique, and that's why it's so awesome, and that's why we're all involved in it in some way, shape, or form. But unfortunately, not everybody speaks our language. So we need to adapt when talking with our non-STEM audiences. And I want to emphasize that it's not about eliminating the science behind the definitions of the words. It's just explaining it in a way that others can really understand more of, almost like a real world definition for them and how it impacts them. Sometimes having to do this and having to shift our mindset and getting into these conversations can be somewhat frustrating. We want to limit our assumptions that we have going into these conversations, but also just be patient and listen. I'm going to say it 100 times probably. So listening and listening and listening is so important. So there are ways to define these types of words without limiting their impact. This is just a very short list. These are, of course, are not the only ways to do so or even the most accurate definitions. It's just showing you that there are ways to provide alternatives. And so, however it might be, these are the things that, you know, it's going to be on you to put the effort in and practice and really just get comfortable to the point where eventually it's just going to become part of the conversation. And that's where we want to go. We want to be able to walk into a conversation on the beach in a public hearing and be able to explain what we're doing without losing our audience because we're using words that they just simply aren't familiar with. So the next thing I want you to do is just, again, either write them down or throw them in the chat and we'll talk about it at the end. But I want you to take another 30 or so seconds. What are some of the aquaculture words or jargon that you yourselves might be using on a regular basis that could be confusing to some of your stakeholders, right? If you do go, like for me particularly, I think about situations when I've had to go out, collect tissue here on the coast of either Portland, Cape Elizabeth, South Portland, and then I walk out onto the beach and I explain to the public what it is I'm doing. There are ways that I can do that without confusing everybody. Benthos. And so we want to just start thinking about these types of words, you know. Take the time to sit down with yourself, with your team, and get an understanding of, hey, a lot of times this is just rolls off the tongue for us. What does it mean to them, right? Because we also don't want to give them the wrong idea and the wrong definition if they assume it's something else. So then once we acknowledge who we are talking to as stakeholders, and then how we can change our word choice by simplifying our language, we got to start finding a balance between what their expectations are of the work that we do in our aquaculture profession, and then the challenges that are going to come with it. Okay, so challenges, but we also want to highlight and recognize all the cool stuff and the positive impacts that your work is having in the community. But I think it's important to know that when we go into these types of conversations, there are some people that are going to create some pushback. And when you're approaching these audiences, you've got to prepare for those types of communication challenges that go further than just the terminology that we have. Okay. And so this is where our emotional intelligence comes in. So if you're able to recognize a situation where you may get stressed or find, and some levels of anxiety, you've got to prepare yourself to walk into those conversations so that we have more productive conversations with these people instead of you just being frustrated the whole time, right? So we got to think about ways to interpret our language and know how much to share, because honestly, we don't have to share every single detail to get the point across, right? And nowadays we have so many different platforms, online, in person, whatever it might be, that we also got to prepare for how to do that and not making any assumptions of what our audience already knows. Okay. And then I know this is going to be hard to hear, but sometimes we got to limit our data driven communication when we're walking into a non-STEM audience and having a conversation. Sometimes we got to leave the statistics and the charts and the graphs out of it and find a different avenue to really connect with them. And so challenges, with these types of conversations, they're not just going to come from communication specifically. And because, and this might be disappointing to hear, but not everybody is going to really value or prioritize the work that we do as much as we ourselves will. Okay. And that could be frustrating, right? But that doesn't shift the fact that we have to go into this conversation with that mindset, knowing that, hey, they might not care about the same type of information and the same type of science that we all know and love. And honestly, there might even be some history there. There might be a lack of trust or some preconceived narratives that have nothing to do with us as an individual. And now it's on you to try to find a way to shift those preconceived narratives. But honestly, like the challenges that come from that are pretty much a small sample size of people, I think, in the grand scheme of things. There's so many communities and scientists and individuals and states and nations that really openly support all the work that aquaculture professionals do and what they bring to the community and bring to the forefront. And that's what we want to have as a major part of the conversation. So one of the most important ways that we can successfully discuss our work with people outside of our field is by finding a way to connect it to their lives and their concerns and their interests. So I want to introduce storytelling, which is a tool that allows us to engage with our audience. And when I keep saying audience, but really, I mean, it could be one person, it could be 100 people. It doesn't really matter. It's just whoever you're bringing this message to or whoever you're engaging in a conversation with. We don't want to just read to them or dictate statistics to them, trying to get our point solidly across. All right. When we take more of a storytelling approach to it, all right, we're able to share our work and our science now as a resource and a voice that needs to be supported and can be supported by, the groups that we're talking to. Now you're able to help them connect to that science by simplifying the concepts. And then we want to make, basically, overall, our goal should be making science accessible to more people so that they have a better understanding of what it is that we do, but also why it is that we do. And so this can help inspire others in the future. So again, we're trying to find a way to connect our work to their lives, and we do this through what is called storytelling. And we utilize this technique so that we can motivate people to take action and connect to them emotionally instead of just throwing facts at them. And so this is why you've got to practice this. Well, you got to practice any type of public speaking, really. You got to practice your presentations, your negotiating skills. And honestly, you guys are so passionate about your work, and you should be, because this is what you've chosen as a career. And so we want to let that passion shine through. You're starting to tell a story about how, hey, I recognize the challenge. And then, I saw it was a problem, but we were able to find a way to overcome it and start to find solutions that can positively impact everybody. So you want to do that, but just in a way that people are engaged and can understand. When we look at this checklist here, it's, who are we speaking to? Who is our main, what is the main takeaway? How does it connect with our audience? What actions do you want them to take? And how is this going to be impactful? Some things that we might want to avoid, though, is, again, being too technical or being too preachy and missing out on that connection, that emotional connection, or maybe they're just, you want to make sure that you're the person that should be sharing the message, right? If the only information that you have in the moment is to share technical data, you can share that. But as far as trying to shift the narrative that you're trying to push, might not be able to connect as well until you're prepared to really understand their point of view and see it from an emotional standpoint. And please just don't dismiss someone else's concerns, right? You're not them. You haven't lived their life. As crazy as it might sound, and maybe it doesn't make any sense, whatever it is they're talking about, but just sit there and just listen, ask some questions, right? And then continue the conversation. And if you need to follow up, provide them, your resources to follow up on that conversation later. And creating the narrative of why is very important, because it helps provide the understanding as to why we were even drawn to these projects in the first place, right? Why are we involved with it? And we're moving away from people what they need to do, and it's more of, hey, this is why we're taking this perspective on this aquaculture project or program, and this is how it can connect to your community. So we want to keep it structured just like any other story. There's going to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And, just thinking about ways like, why did we start this oyster farm or kelp farm? And why did we need a recirculating system to raise these fish? And, why did you pick this location versus going down the coast a little bit further that's not in my front yard? So keep it relevant to them. And, you're doing great work and it's exciting you, but you want to keep them engaged and really try to captivate the people that you're talking to. But this, of course, takes effort and time and practice. And so the next exercise that we're not going to get into too much right now is creating this story. And there's a lot of different steps that you can take, and that worksheet has specific steps 1 through 6 in a little bit more detail that you can work through. But I just want to keep emphasizing that this isn't about it's not about making things less scientific. It's just about presenting real scientific work in a way that people can understand and remember, right? So in the worksheet, there's a whole bunch of steps that go through, but again, you just want to know your audience, find a way to really capture their attention from the get-go, like what really drew you to this specific project or species or area, and get them hooked right away. Then work through some elements of the story, what was the challenge? How did you work together to solve a problem? And how is that going to have an impact on the community or them individually? And try to keep it structured so you're not all over the place. And then please just don't forget to have some connection to an emotion in there. Like, what is the message you really are trying to share with them? Do you want them to come away with a feeling of hope or reassurance or even urgency, right? There's a lot of urgency out there right now. So how do we do that in a way that's not being pushy or overbearing? Okay. So make sure that they're walking away with that same mindset. And again, practice, 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 practice. So how are we as individuals going to start making our own changes? So to see growth, we need to start really self-assessing where we are as individuals, how our communication styles work in a public setting with people who don't work in our field. I emphasize self-assessments all the time. There is one in the worksheet as well. It's not challenging. It's very, very basic. It's just kind of a starter point for you to see what you might be really good at and what areas you might need to work on. Okay, obviously, we're all going to start to be more self-aware of the type of words that we're using in these conversations so that we can start simplifying those words in a way that they can understand. Gain a better understanding of who is related to the work that you do. Even if you're not involved in a specific sector of the job, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have to talk about it at some point. So have a full understanding of not just this is the work I do. I work in a hatchery. That's it. That's my job. That's as far as I'm connected. Your organization, your company, it goes way further than that. How does the work that you do connect to somebody who lives down the street or who lives in a city nearby or who lives on the other side of the country? Okay. So start thinking about ways that you can share these stories, practice that, practice simplifying your communication, and then remember that we're trying to make connections and finding ways to connect to their concerns, to the concerns of others. And that happens by actively listening without trying to have a conversation in your head before they stop speaking. You're listening, you're there, and you're present. And then we can start building on those conversations. So with that, you can, of course, also reach out to me if you want to go into this in any more detail. Like Joe said, I have a leadership in science page on AIE. If you want to start any ideas, conversations, on there, you can absolutely post. Please, I want to get more engagement in there. I need to be more engaging in there as well. And feel free to reach out with any comments, questions that you might have.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. That was really great. I
Yeah.
agree with a lot of what you said. And yeah, I wanted to before we jump into the questions, I'm really excited for this Q&A section, based on the chat so far. But I also just wanted to say, in addition to the leadership and science group that I'll link to in the chat, we also have a communicators group on the AIE. And I would just encourage everybody on here, if you have a question or if you're trying to do some of these exercises that Chris suggested and you want some feedback or some advice, I think that group is a great place to get it. Um, speaking as a communicator myself, like we're happy to help. And it really is, I think, such an important question to be having in the aquaculture industry, just because like as an industry, oh yeah, and Emily is the moderator of the communicators group, and she does a great job too. But yeah, I think as the aquaculture industry, we run up against a lot of misconceptions about or misperceptions about what aquaculture is. Um, and I think like to get aquaculture to where agriculture is at, in the US, I think it is up to us applying a lot of these communication techniques that Chris just outlined. And then the last thing I'll say is we also have our YouTube channel, which is where I upload these recordings for our webinars. So I will drop the link to that in the chat as well, if you want to share the recording once it's up. But yeah, we can take questions if you want to drop your question in the chat or just raise your hand um, and ask Chris directly that way. But yeah, this is really great.
Yeah, and I'll post um the documents that I put in that QR code at the beginning. I'll post those in the leadership group as well.
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
As many people do, I have kind of a comment and a question. So I went to a presentation at University of Florida. That's where I'm at. And it was by Benji Backer, who does kind of bridging different basically bridging the partisan divide for environmentalism, basically. And one of the things that he said was like what he tries to do when he meets someone is figure out their why. Like, what is it that they're operating off of, and like why they hold the opinion that they do? Because often, like, if you dig deep enough, their why is something you can relate to. Like, I think one example of this is like with jobs, for example, someone might be, anti wind energy because they work in, oil or gas. And so when you figure out their why, it's like, well, they want to provide for their family and they're not sure they'll be able to do that if there's a change. And so that's then where you can kind of start the conversation from is, how do we make sure we have jobs in the energy sector? And so I guess I was just curious, Chris, what your thoughts are on that, because I think with aquaculture and these preconceived notions, a lot of people might already have like negative feelings towards it, and maybe we're scared or anxious to confront those, and we don't really know how to do that. And so, yeah, I was just kind of curious about your opinion on how do you do that? Like when someone has a negative idea, how do you get to their why without feeling like you're interviewing them?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this happens a lot. And I had mentioned it, right? Like walking into these conversations, you have to be aware that not everybody sees this from the same perspective as we do. So the why behind everything is so valuable and so important. I had, mentioned before that this is where you're going to start to really start to break down and connect their perspectives. And so by asking just basic questions about how they connected to aquaculture, how are they connected to, this industry, or what their concerns are. We break those down a little bit, but you've got to be really just the active listening part is so important, because a lot of times when we walk into conversations where we want somebody to say a certain thing, we are already ready to speak before they've even finished answering the question. And you have to really, really work on just starting the conversation, asking that why, listening to their answer, not already answering it in your head, just listening to what they say, even reading it back or saying it back to them so that they understand that you're involved in the conversation. And then eventually throughout that conversation, depending on how long it lasts, you're going to be able to start asking further, I call them clarifying questions, right? So we want to start asking clarifying questions to really start breaking down their perspectives, because obviously it seems already that they have a different perspective than you do. So you want to get that point of view in a way that you can still share the information that you have, and maybe it happens in real time and maybe it doesn't, and that's something you need to follow up with in terms of providing them with the resources of how the work that you're doing does connect to them and does benefit them. But I think I mentioned it before too, just don't dismiss their perspective just because it doesn't align with ours. And it just goes back to that high level of emotional intelligence and active skills are just two huge parts of the foundation of communicating. And as scientists, if you really we want people to, it's like, how do you not see that this is going to be helpful to us? How do you not understand it? What do you not get? Right? And just shake them. But again, that's because we've done the research, we've done the work, we work with really awesome people who are working hard to share this type of data and science and try to change the world. But not everybody has done that. Other people are living other lived experiences that you have not. And it's more beneficial to you to just listen and start asking clarifying questions and asking why, and just keep breaking that down. Okay, so how does that work in this scenario? And how does that work in your community? And how involved, right? Call them out on call to action. How are you involved in this arena? How are you involved? How are you trying to make a difference? And how are you trying to make changes in this perspective that you have? And yeah, it's hard though, because we work in such a unique arena, whether it's in aquaculture or other areas of not just marine science, but environmental science and oceanography and climate science and sustainability. I mean, there's so many fragile worlds in our jobs right now because there's a lot of pushback. And I mean, just the other day I had a conversation with a guy who has zero science background whatsoever, but he swore that sea level rise was a myth, and he tried to explain it to me. And you just kind of, you take a breath, you don't laugh at them, you don't fight back, you just provide them with the knowledge that you have in a way that isn't super scientific. It's just, yeah, that I hear what you're saying, but you're not thinking about, the ice that's actually on land versus the ice that's in the water. And like we're getting into a whole thing about global warming, and so it happens all the time. It's just, I tell people, take a breath, be patient. You just got to be patient and just listen.
Totally. Yeah, and I'll add to that as far as the clarifying questions. Something that I've been working on is to not let those be leading questions where you're basically trying to steer them into
Yeah.
like your point of view. Like it really has to be based on empathy, like you're saying, Chris, and really curiosity as to why they're coming at it the way that they are. But Rachel had a question next.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so I've got maybe not so much a question but also a comment. So, my background, I was an oyster farmer for about 5 years. Before that, I had no relevant experience. I was a wedding planner, all these random jobs, but no aquaculture, no farming, no marine science background. Ended up in oyster farming, loved it, and now I work in oyster catering, and I do a lot of educational events. And so my question for you and my comment is that I often find I've gotten better these days, but in the past I've struggled with situations where I'm in a mixed crowd, where it's people who know nothing about aquaculture, nothing about oysters, but also my peers and scientists and farmers. And I've often struggled with the feeling of, okay, I want to communicate with the people that I know don't know anything, but I also don't want to sound dumb in front of my peers. And so, I'll say things like, my people ask, well, how does an oyster grow? And I'll start with saying things like, well, when a mommy oyster loves a daddy oyster, they get together, and it really connects with the people who don't know anything. But I sometimes wonder if my peers think that, like, okay, she's
No, you're
clearly showing that she's got no knowledge other than what she learned on the farms. So yeah, maybe just some insight from you would be great on that topic.
Yeah, but think about it. Like, that is the perfect connection. You are from the outside world, outside of aquaculture. You understand how you would want it explained to yourself, right? In that capacity.
Hmm.
And it also shows that if your colleagues are getting, you know, they're not going to laugh at you first off because you're trying to help. And if they are, they're not your friends. Get them out of there anyways.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be afraid to share those ideas from a perspective of somebody who is outside it. And honestly, having to say things like mommy and daddy, I mean, sometimes we have to get down to that specific level of communication so that we do understand it. Now, the scientists that you're working with, they obviously know that, hey, this is just the way that we're sharing this information on a level that people outside of the industry need to know. And it's a simple way to do it. Now, hopefully you're also explaining it correctly, right? Like
Yeah.
they may jump in if there's something that maybe you missed or maybe was incorrect or whatever that is. But I think you carrying that message forward to them and even calling them out on being able to do that themselves is really
Mhm.
important, to just challenge them to be able to communicate on that level, to be able to take just a step down, just to simplify it enough that we're not losing the point, right? And we're still getting that message across. It
Mm.
took me 20 years to explain to my grandmother the difference between a shark and a whale. I mean, I was 7 years old, but it was just like, you have to get it down to a level where, if they're engaging with you, make it fun, make it engaging, and relevant to what they're asking. And if, as far as being embarrassed, don't be embarrassed for speaking up in a way that you know how to communicate. You have a different perspective on how to communicate with a different audience. That honestly, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because in the science world, it is really challenging to communicate, not just individually, interpersonally, in our own teams, but out in the real world as well. And so that is a valuable, tool and gift to have because you've worked on both sides.
Mm. I've also found that my way of thinking has helped me learn as well, because sometimes I'll explain something in a way that I think is so basic and so simple, and someone says,
Mhm.
"Yeah, but what does that mean?" And there are times where I'm like, I don't think I actually know what that means. So, for
Yeah, there
example,
you go.
I was trying to describe to somebody the hinge versus the adductor muscle,
Mhm.
and they're like, "Wait, so they both keep the oyster closed?" I'm like, "Yeah, but no, but sort of." And then I ended up going home Googling adductor versus hinge, what does what? And so, um, there's always more to learn.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anyone here that's saying they're not learning anything, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you should be learning something new, all the time. And in your field, maybe it is your next step as someone who's considered an expert in aquaculture to learn how to communicate better, how to communicate your work out into the community, and not just be stuck in this cool, awesome bubble that we get to do in the field, but getting out there. And I know it's hard. It's hard. Trust me. I understand getting out and doing public speaking can be very challenging. It can be nerve wracking. It's not for everybody, but eventually it's going to be part of your job. Whether you're prepared for it or not, you're going to have to do it. Whether you're at the beach and someone asks you, what you're doing, or you're doing research at the beach. Like I said, when I'm samples or whatever the situation is, you're at a party and you just spark up a conversation. You're going to have to talk about it at some point. So you might as well prepare to do so at a level that is easier for other people to hear.
Great.
So
Thanks so much for your time.
don't stop speaking up.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. That you sort of read my mind. That was where my the question that I sort of wanted to ask. But yeah, next up we have a heavy hitter in terms of communication. It's Gene Codin, who's the editor of Aquaculture North America, Hatchery
Woo.
International, other publications. So Gene, yeah, go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Joseph. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate what you've kind of laid out for us today. And my main question is sort of like an observation, I guess, in terms of public discourse. And I think the main challenge for the industry when they kind of come to the general public with making a case for the industry is sort of like that exchange of different reports. I can kind of point to an example of, anti-aquaculture groups, and the main research that they would point to is sort of like the sea lice levels that are taking place in Norway, for example, but then you have DFO reports in BC that say, you know, sea lice is higher than ever, but BC farms are shut down and things like that. And sort of that exchanging of different data that to support, you know, certain sides or certain points of view. And like, how do you do you have advice on navigating that? Because I don't know if it's productive to be exchanging data in that way. And like, how do you get to a productive, I guess, place when you're doing that?
Yeah, so that's going to happen a lot, right? I mean, especially in the science world. I think the only thing that I can say is, you know the information that you have, right? You have available to provide, and it goes back to, not trying to really be too pushy about it. Just, this is the information that I have. This is why I believe that it is relevant. This is why I believe this is a relatable, or I guess I should say reliable source, but let them know that you're open to hearing and talking more about the perspective that they have. You can sit there all day and say who's right and who's wrong. I think should be more about, all right, hey, this is great. I'd love to hear more about what you have on this topic, because what I'm hearing and what I've seen and what I've read and what I've done in the field personally is showing me that this is what is happening with sea lice in this specific area. And I've done this research, but I'm open to hearing some other perspectives to see if that would shift my narrative at all. I'd love to check in with you at a future date, and maybe we can sit down online and kind of have a bigger discussion, because if you're trying to just go back and forth in person, I mean, some people are really good at that in terms of just spitting off the statistics that they have in their head because they want to specifically make a point to somebody and try to kind of prove that other person wrong, right? It's just not how I believe communication should be in a conversation. I think we should be more open to hearing other perspectives. Absolutely. It shouldn't ever mean that somebody else is wrong. It just means that, hey, if you and I are talking about this specific topic, all right, that's great. I've seen in this situation from this perspective and this person that I've talked with closely, and I've done this research myself, is what you can bring to the table. But I would love to talk about the information that you have so that we can expand on it further later on, instead of just butting heads and you're just not going to get anywhere. No, I mean, it happens all the time, and it just kind of comes to a standstill of, well, who has the most statistics in their head? Okay, well, it doesn't need to be that kind of a contest.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Gene. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that with you more at the RASTech conference, or the Recirculating Aquaculture System Technology Conference, to avoid jargon.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I think this might be building off Jean's question. We'll see. Because I know, like, as an editor and then also as someone who's working with social media, I'm curious what you have to say about that type of one-way communication. I mean, there is comments and such, but generally you don't have a back and forth. You don't necessarily know your audience's why. You can do your best to research it and anticipate it, but there's not the same kind of feedback loop that there is in interpersonal communication. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about that.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to get too much into the social media stuff because it can become such a toxic environment. I have a friend who was running a social media account for a very popular aquarium, and he was phenomenal at it because he'd get so many negative comments every day. And so he would just ask clarifying questions. What background do you have? Where'd you get that information from? Making a joke, trying to kind of nip it in the bud if you can, because going back and forth on the internet can lead to some bad places, especially if you're part of a company, if you're part of, you're representing an entire organization. We got to be very careful about going back and forth there. And so, again, providing them with the resources that you have is all you can really do sometimes. And then offering them up ways to connect with you offline if you're comfortable doing that. right? This is what we've seen because of X, Y, and Z. And then they just bark and they bite and they say bad things. And you gotta, again, come into those situations with a higher level of emotional intelligence than the people online, because you are preparing yourself for stressful situations and being reactive, and you need to prepare yourself to not also react in a way that could just optically harm yourself as an individual, harm the company. Asking them where they've got, where they obtained that information is always a good one. Like, where did you get those statistics from? What sources do you have to back that up? Asking those types of questions, because yeah, you're not going to get a lot of background information just from going online. And so I think also pointing them towards the resources, like if you have those types of resources that you are using on your website, pointing them in that direction is going to help as well, right? Like, hey, these are some great questions. I'd love to share the resources that we have on our website with you. Go check this page out. It kind of breaks down the perspective that I have here. If you still have more questions about it, you know where to find us. Here's an info email if you want to send in an email, and I can follow up later on with some more in-depth, answers for you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I think we are going to call it there. But yeah, thanks again to Chris for presenting. This has been another great AIE webinar, and yeah, hope to see y'all at the next one.
Thanks,
Have a
guys.
good rest of your week.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Bye.